expert, and Mariam Malik from London. So Mariam's one of our young people who really has excelled in terms of ability to talk about climate change and what's going on. So real pleasure to have you both with us. If you're tuning in to see Zion Lights, then sadly she was off sick this morning, but luckily Mariam was able to step in instead. Thank you so much. Okay, so this is the 16th of our webinars this year, about 1.5 max, and it's the last of our 6 to do with COP26 Glasgow. Gary's been with me the whole way through as our man, getting this onto Facebook, etc. So big thank you, Gary, to you and Loving Social Media for making this possible. It wouldn't be possible without you. Okay,
Charles, you fuel my sense of purpose. I'm very lucky to be involved with this, so thank you.
Okay, so we're going to start with some intros to everybody. I'll start with myself. So my name's Charles Appleby. I'm the founder of NoCO2.org. So we plant trees, and the idea is that by planting lots and lots of trees, we can help stop global warming. We planted 453,000 trees so far, and we will almost certainly have planted 500,000 trees by Christmas. This is a voluntary event. Everyone's donated their time and efforts. So if you are able to make a contribution, plant some trees, that would be absolutely amazing. So the link is behind me. £20, we will plant 180 trees for you, and that creates nearly 2 days of paid work for families in extreme poverty. So let's start then. Alvin, would you like to give an intro to yourself and then over to Mariam?
Yeah, hi, I'm a climate science communicator. I've been working in this area probably now going on 15 years. For the last 10 years, I've been working directly with about 200 Australian climate scientists across 5 universities. And prior to that, I was working in an agency which focused on energy clients. And prior to that, I was with WWF as one of their West Australian managers with a focus on climate change there. So I come at it with sort of the advocacy, the industry and the science side of things. So that's essentially my climate science background.
Okay, Mariam.
So hi, I'm Mariam. I'm a student in SOAS. I'm studying international relations, and I'm really here to just voice the opinion of young people in terms of what's going on around the world. So yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
Super. So pleased you could join us. So let's just start off by understanding what COP26 has been like for you. We've had a load of speakers who've been at COP26. So let's start with me. So COP26 for me has been really busy. We've had these 6 webinars with Gary. We've had 15 plus speakers giving their view. And yesterday I was sitting there with 3 screens in front of me, all with different live video from COP26, thinking, well, what on earth is going on? And actually, we missed a scoop, Gary, sadly, because Stefan was showing us live the start of this walkout by the civil society, and someone else was talking. So we should have got Stefan to switch his camera and tell us what was going on, because we had this live on screen. But there you are. That's what happens with live events. So that's what I was doing. So Alvin and then Mariam. Alvin, how was your COP26? Were you deeply reading multiple versions of drafts, or what were you doing?
Look, I have had a look at a few drafts. I haven't seen the latest draft. I've seen the second draft. For me, it's been, I'm in Australia, so of course I'm observing from afar. I've been looking for what I consider to be the things that make COP26 meaningful in my mind. My wife put it really beautifully last night when we were talking about COP26, is that what's happening at COP26 is we're making the choice as to whether humans want to be part of Earth's recovery or not from climate change. Because if we don't act, we won't be around when it comes back, many thousands, perhaps even millions of years into the future. So my interest has been on what is the likelihood that something genuine is going to come out of it. And I've got some kind of measures that I use for that. So I call it the 3 things to look for when the backslapping starts. So is it a pledge? Because lots and lots of COPs have seen people make all sorts of promises and pledges, but there's only been one country in the world that's actually managed to keep its pledges, and that's Gambia. Everybody else has failed at every single COP. Is it a binding agreement? Because that starts to bring in, is there something legal attached to it? But for me, the most important thing is we're now 6 years on from Paris and we haven't signed off on it yet. And to me, and I haven't seen this third draft, so I don't know if we've actually managed to cross through Article 6 and some of the financial things that were holding up the finalization of the Paris Agreement. But if we sign off on Paris, we've actually made a start. But if we don't, it's another year. So to give you some kind of context, we're talking about this decade being really, really important to make a difference. To get to net zero, we've got to hit half our emissions be cut within those first 10 years to stay below 2 degrees. We can forget about 1.5. I said that last time, I still hold with that. But if we come to an agreement and it's not signed off at Glasgow and we negotiate for another 6 years, well, then you can forget net zero as well. So those are the things. I want to see what's binding and have we got signed off on Paris. If we nail those two things, then this is unbelievable success. If we nail one of them, we've done very, very well. So I'm extremely intrigued to see where Paris sits in all of this. Those are the kind of things.
Well, Alvin, I think you should have been on the COP26 team with your clarity here. Now, Mariam, you've been, I'm sure, amazingly busy as a student at the wonderful SOAS on international relations. When in the minutes when you're not doing that, what have you been doing about COP26?
I think when looking at COP26, I think generally young people found that it was a lot of information, a lot going on. So taking in key parts, I think, was what most young people are trying to do. But I think what really resonates with young people is Greta Thunberg's stance on how she feels COP26 is really like. And I think young people do feel that it's like blah, 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 as she said. It's like there are empty promises. There's nothing really that, fulfills young people's wishes. And young people's wishes are really strong dedication towards tackling the climate change. And I feel that when we look and we saw these speakers come up here, we saw leaders speaking, did we truly feel that they were dedicated to producing a future for us that is sustainable, that answers the questions that we want? I think that there was a question there, and I don't think young people are confident to say that yes, they have shown dedication towards a greener, better future. And I think that's something that COP26 was that was highlighted for young people during COP26.
Amazing, Mariam. I see huge similarities between the sentiment of what Alvin and you have said, but you've each expressed it in such completely different ways. So that's amazing. Thank you so much. So let's then look at first. Let's look at really for each of you what actually. I mean, I've got the draft, the 8 a.m. this morning draft in front of me. I see a lot of wording around. Urging and strongly urge and these sorts of things and strongly note, but let's go straight to what do you think actually was achieved from what we know at COP26? So let's start with Alvin. Alvin, you're on mute.
My bad. So that's a really, really good question. So I think one of the most interesting things to come out of this that's a positive is that we're going to see the world leaders brought together again in 2023. And there's now going to be a very direct program that measures the commitments each country has made against the potential for staying under 1.5 and 2 degrees. And so what I like about this is that it's one of those things where every year governments are now going to have to face up to this because it's now become part of every single COP from here on in. So every year around this time, there are going to be news stories about how well your country is doing compared to the supposed commitments that it made, commitments, pledges. The only word that really matters here, or two words, are binding and mandate. And I don't see them much in even the third version. So I think that's good because it exposes these people. And if you have a look at what's happened in Australia, we came and, as usual, were the spoilers. We were probably the least impressive of the sort of developed nations at COP26. But our Prime Minister has come back and then started talking about electric cars and climate change and doing things which are not a great deal more than were already in there, but he started to market around it. And that tells me that he's concerned. So this kind of thing where every year you're exposing your country to the spotlight of where it is on climate change versus its pledges, and the suggestion that they think it's now important enough for them to look like they're doing something, that suggests to me a tipping point. And I do believe a big part of that tipping point is people like Marianne. The young people are now starting to vote and be a force, and climate change has moved up in terms of the important issues. So for me, that's the positive. It's probably the only real positive I've seen to this point. I'm very much with Greta on the blah, blah, blah. Lots of talk. I would much prefer that we got rid of these big COPs. I'm going on a bit long here, where we have 30,000 people come from around the world. It takes 15 minutes to walk from one end to the other. I would much rather see the hardcore negotiators in there quietly getting on with the job without all this marketing around them, because that's where the real decisions are going to be made. And the leaders come when there are announcements to be made. And I think this is why I feel like this is Copenhagen with better marketing, because what happened here was, even a few months out, we could already see that there weren't any solid negotiations taking place with announcements. So yeah, for me, that one thing shines for me. I'm really, really hopeful that this latest draft has got Paris moving, but I haven't had a decent read of it yet, so I can't say.
Okay, thank you so much. I thought we'd reached a tipping point on the 22nd of April this year when Joe Biden brought everyone together. That was Earth Day, and the US made this big commitment to cut CO2 emissions by around 50%. I thought we were there then. And then that flowed on to the G7 meeting in June, which is very positive, about 1.5. And then when that got to the G20, it slowed down. But so same question for you, Mariam. What do you think has been important coming out of COP26?
I think I just can't echo enough what Alvin said. I completely agree with him. I think that what really came out of COP26 is seeing that countries are present and that they have to show their presence. But otherwise, are they really doing something? Or is this a big facade to say, well, we're going to do something, but are we implementing it? Well, you'll have to find out later. This is just the beginning, sort of thing. So what came out of it is in a positive way. I think in some aspects it's not full accountability, but if we put in accountability, I think it's a nice way of saying that people were there and present. I think that's what you could say came out of it.
Okay, so the other side of it then, what was most disappointing with this, Alvin?
Okay. One of the things that's really, really interesting, and to me is that if you have a look this time, you compare this draft to, say, the Paris draft and probably previous drafts as well, is all of a sudden adaptation has shifted up. Now, adaptation used to sit way down below and mitigation was the thing. So the moment that you make adaptation near the top, you're admitting that you can no longer mitigate. So you're saying that there are going to be climate change impacts to which you have to adapt. And there's a lot of negotiation going around at the moment too, in terms of not just helping developing nations to adapt, but also in terms of financing them for the damages that climate change will bring. And in fact, that's one of the really knotty negotiations that are taking place right now that could kind of slow things down. So to me, that's kind of like an admission of failure from the past. I think there were some really interesting things in terms of pledges that were made. So the Methane Pledge is a really interesting one, though we didn't get the number of sign-ups to that we should have. So that originally came through Biden and the EU. And the idea is, but it's also interesting who didn't sign on to that. I feel that that's a pledge that has some legs, but you need to get everybody on board. And I don't think that's happening. When I just took some notes, I was a little disappointed, and this must bother you, Charles, about the deforestation negotiations. So initially we were talking about deforestation, and there was some lovely pledges made by quite a large number of countries, including Australia, strangely enough. And then about 2 days later, we already saw Indonesia starting to qualify and say, oh, no, we will do what's economically viable, which essentially becomes code that we will do it as long as we keep having a strong economy and deforestation slows down. I was really disappointed that they decided not to define degradation and include that in the deforestation approach as well, because degradation always tends to lead to deforestation. So I think for me, there's some, the fact that we're talking about it is really good. But the fact that we keep watering it down and reducing it is a bit of a negative. One of the big pluses I also quite liked was that for the first time, despite the protests of people like Russia and Australia and Saudi Arabia, we're talking about coal as get rid of coal, phase it out. So there's some quite strong language around that, which is really, really interesting and really useful. But again, I come back to those things that we want to watch. What are pledges? What are things that they are actually going to do? What are mandates? And will we end up with the Paris Agreement at the end of COP26? To me, that's massively important.
Okay, so back to the main thing being the disappointment around things that are binding and things that are being really signed off. So Mariam, what about yourself? What was focusing on the question of what for you was most disappointing about COP26?
I think when I look at this question, I think for me is how much do they listen to young people in COP26? I understand that there is COI 16. I believe that's between the 28th and 31st, if I'm correct. And it's good that we have a young people a discussion, but how much of this discussion is being implemented and heard in COP26? Are they just saying, well, we have a representative here, they've spoken, and are we going to listen to them? I think that's something that young people really want to know. How much of what we say and who represents us are you going to show and show commitment to what policies and arguments they put forward? And I didn't really feel in COP26 that there was this strong sort of support and showing for what young people have put forward. And the fact that there is a side sort of conference of COI 16 for young people, is there some sort of exclusion there that we feel that not all young people's voice are heard in COP26? I think that's something that for me it was kind of something that should be tackled or could have been better, more young people policies seen.
Mariam, you put it amazingly, as you always do. You're on center stage here, Mariam, so go for it. So let's move on to the main question at the heart of this. Where did COP26 go wrong? So I've got a little list to prompt you. Was it the UK leadership of COP26? Was it poor communication by governments and the UN? Was the fossil fuel lobby too strong? Were world leaders just not brave enough? Did the EU, which at the end of the day is 27 countries as a bloc, did the EU underperform? Or fundamentally, were people really just not bothered? Are people, the bulk of the people, just not bothered about wrecking our planet and the future of our children? So, Alvin.
Wow, so much. So where did it go wrong? I think we've got to ask ourselves, we've been doing this now 26 years. And Kyoto Protocol and, say, Paris have been the two things that come out of it. And the last time I was here, I said the real measure of success is found in the Keeling curve, which is the measure of how many carbon emissions are going into the atmosphere. Go have a look at it. It hasn't budged. And in fact, it's accelerated a bit. So where did it go wrong? It went wrong, as it always does and always will do, because of self-interest. So what you have is we are trying to get the entire world to come together to agree to something. And we're bringing the leaders of different countries who want to remain the leaders and that, particularly democracies that have a 3 to 4 year term before they have to be voted in again. And particularly after COVID as well, everyone's worried about their economy. And the thing that we kind of don't like to talk about, but we have to talk about, is that this transition will cost some people. Okay, there will be impacts and there will be winners and losers, and some countries will lose more than others. Now, because of that, those countries will only move when they can find a way to do that without losing. And so what you have is this kind of national self-interest of preserving the country and its economy and the people in power. And then you're trying to bring them all together to do something for the good of the world. And unfortunately, we are generally short-term. This generation in particular, this idea of individualism and doing things for ourselves and becoming the richest and the best, and at the exclusion and hurt of all others, is something that's very much of that 80s generation, the generation that's come through, my generation, which owes a huge apology already to the generation that's coming, to Marianne's generation. And it is the younger generation that I'm watching, including my son and Marianne, who are looking beyond themselves who seem to be caring beyond themselves. That's where I think the change will come. And unfortunately, I can't see them coming into power for the next 10 to 15 years, but I do see them having influence and growing influence. So I think there'll be some forced changes. But I unfortunately think we'll be relying on the next generation to do this, which means 2 degrees is probably on the cards. 3 degrees is becoming dangerously likely. But that's the generation that will change it. And I'm afraid that history is not going to look kindly on my generation, even though we have some people fighting to do the right thing. So I think that's the reason.
Thank you. Mariam, you can have influence. So where do you think it went wrong?
I think it comes down to, for me personally, it comes down to leadership. Leaders want to ensure that their country is above all strong, secure, but they always seem to do it at the cost of the environment. They don't seem to want to collaborate with others. And there is this notion of the split between the global north and the global south, in terms of there isn't good communication and links and working together to improve the world as a whole. And I think there you see selfishness really thrive in governments and leaderships. And I think that's where things need to start. We need to have a good leadership that is willing to collaborate as a whole, rather than individual selfish people who run the country. I think that's where we need to start, because people as a whole, they are aware of the environment. They do want change, but whether these governments and leaders listen, I think there is where we need to start and look, and the problem can start to be solved.
Such a great point. Let me just cover a couple of things we learned. One, yesterday we had Shailen Mittal, who was on the Denmark stand, and at the Denmark stand, Denmark was saying that they are helping 19 other countries with resources, sharing skills, all that sort of thing. So I don't know what the countries were, but that's for me is a real example of massive sharing. And then the second thing, which is a piece of research that I did, which is that, it costs half as much to implement solar, wind, and nuclear in developing countries than it does in developed countries. And then you factor in that if you compare it with the UK, the sun is over twice as strong in India than it is in the UK, the energy per square meter. And parts of India have many more sunny days than the UK does. So India probably is 4 or 5 times more effective for solar than in the UK, and it's half the price. So simple transaction here is, if you're going to spend £1 million on stopping global warming, then it really is not cost effective to spend it in the UK as it is to spend it in a developing country. So I really hope that sharing is taken into account in what goes on. But let's move forward then to the next question, which is that, well, how can we do better? Now I'm going to ask, my question is, how can we achieve 1.5 at COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt next year, or in the UAE in the year after. Now, Alvin's going to say 1.5 is not possible, but so the question for you is, Alvin, how can we do the best possible at the next two COPs? And Mariam, then when you answer it, perhaps you can talk about 1.5. But let's start with Alvin.
Wow, how do we do better? I think in some ways we make it less of a show. At the moment, I feel like everybody's going there, and it's almost like a kind of weird type of greenwashing in a way, where so many people come along to say how they're doing the right thing and to make their voices heard. But the actual practical, pragmatic, tough negotiations that need to be done need to happen really in small, quieter spaces. And I think that to me is where I want to be. I only want to see the leaders there when there is a really solid decision that they've all come and agreed on. I don't want to see this huge circus of people coming along and turning this into a massive industry conference. I want to see this done solidly. That to me is a win. Having said that, one of the quiet wins was, I think, the way industry, and particularly tech industries, have really found cash to get in and help developing nations. And I'd love to follow on what you said, Charles, before, which is that in the West, the developed nations where we've built ourselves on fossil fuel, our problem is going to be that we're going to have to tear down those fossil fuels and the infrastructure and rebuild. And in a developing nation, which has barely started along that route, it's actually less costly. And for them to build a renewable infrastructure from scratch is actually cheaper. So I do wonder if maybe the developing nations are delaying this for their own purposes. And this idea that you heard a few years ago that, coal will bring them out of poverty is just a complete farce. But yeah, at the end of the day, two things. It has to be small, it has to be hardcore negotiators, and if industry can come along and lead, then that's the way to do it as well. I have a feeling industry will probably lead our politicians for years to come. That's my thought.
Okay. Mariam.
I think when it comes, I agree completely with Alvin, by the way. It does need to be done in a quieter sort of place where you can get things done immediately, and there isn't this big parade going on. I don't think that will get really anywhere. I think it's like a facade of what's really going on, and I think that with these negotiations and with these tough negotiations, there should be a real crackdown on industries as a whole, from the clothing fashion industry to food markets, whatever. I feel like there needs to be a strong sort of, I wouldn't call it regulation, but policy, that's the word, policy towards these industries, which will then hopefully bring us to a more sustainable environment. I think that's what we need to do, ensure that global policy is on the same level. I think that's where it needs to start from.
Okay, I think the contribution of business, I mean, we found out from our events, not from the press, we found out from our events that there was a huge dinner on the Friday with 50 really big companies being invited to dinner by certain world leaders. And I think that the way I see it is that it's actually very, very positive to have business driving activity, because we can only buy what they make for sale. So if they're all pushing, for example, take a big example, if they're all pushing diesel and petrol cars, then that's what people will buy. If the manufacturers are pushing electric cars, then we will buy electric type of cars, and that rolls down the whole equation, whether we're getting food with food miles or plastic products or whatever it is. So I do see that as very, very positive. But there's a big question that comes in here, which I do want to ask you, is that, look, in terms of the way forward, what's better? Is it better to have 200 countries who are agreeing a very diluted draft, which is where we are at the moment? That's exactly where we are now. There's been 3 versions of this draft. I've got on the screen in front of me now the draft 3 that came out at 8 o'clock this morning, and something maybe will be agreed this afternoon. Is it better to have 200 countries signing up to that? Or is it better to really acknowledge the difference and say, have a core of countries who are saying, yes, we want 1.5, whatever, and net zero 2050. And then to put a wall around that, to put a trade wall around that, which is carbon pricing, carbon border adjustment, and to leave on the outside countries who are saying, well, it's too difficult, they don't want to, or whatever. Because then they will find countries outside that, then when they're trying to sell their products into the core of this, which in the core of this really is the EU with their current carbon pricing plans and their current border adjustment plans. So anyone trying to sell into the EU and anyone else who joins, and hopefully the UK would join and the US, they will then find that their products are more expensive and therefore are not preferred compared to countries from products from those countries. And at the end of the day, it's not about border adjustments, it's about fairness. It's about fairness that if countries are causing pollution and excess CO2 emissions, then it's only fair that they have to pay for that compared to the others. So which is the best choice? 200 countries agreeing a diluted agreement, or fewer countries having a stronger agreement? Alvin?
I think both. And this sounds really weird. Okay, so if you get the dilute agreement, which I think is what we're going to get, that's one thing. But we're already seeing some countries move quite sharply on this in the EU. And the reason I say both is because it forces other people in power to look at, so we get the agreement, and that allows us to have a base and to kind of ratchet up. It gives us something that at least the whole world's agreed on. And by doing that, they're saying, at least admitting climate change is a problem. But then when you have a certain sector, particularly if it's a powerful sector, saying, right, there are going to be consequences that we have decided to implement ourselves and to move ahead of the game, which is really what happens in competition generally with countries, then it means that other people act. Now, Australia has turned into the most perfect example of this. So Australia's federal government is actually behind every single state government. So the only reason that our emissions are even as good as they are in terms of reduction is because of our state governments. Now, the New South Wales state government, which is the largest state in Australia, has committed to net zero by 2050, has committed to half its emissions by 2030, has made some extraordinary, and this is a conservative government, by the way, has made some extraordinary commitments and changes to legislation that, if the rest of Australia followed, would not only have us signing up to Glasgow and Paris without a second thought, but would probably have us on target to stay well below 2 degrees and stay even within the hand's reach of 1.5. Now, this is happening because the environment minister, who has now just become treasurer, sees this as an economic issue. And so what he's saying is, we have to do these things and we have to do them now because there's going to be a carbon price. Just what you were talking about, Charles, that there is going to be a group of countries who are very important trading partners who are saying, if you're going to give us something full of carbon emissions, we're going to put a tariff on it. And that, to me, is why I say both. Let's get that fundamental, basic, low-level agreement. Don't let the, perfect stand in the way of the good. But let's actually also get some of those people who have real ambition to set up and start to create those trading blocks that force the others to come along, those laggards to chase after them. And that, to me, is the way forward.
Wow, Alvin, what a great answer. So just on that, what happened to carbon pricing and border adjustment? It was floated in the UK papers in the first week, but it just seems to have never broken the surface in discussions.
No idea. It's one of those things that is really, really tough. And when it gets really, really hard, you see two things happen. First, you get this long silence. And the only announcements you'll see every day are going to be these things that are either built on current programs, so we're going to build on it a little bit more, something that already exists, or it's going to be those, we'll give $20 or $30 million to this particular country or this particular thing. And those are things where they're just saying, we've got to keep the positive news cycle going.
Yeah.
But everything else goes quiet. That tells you there's a tough negotiation going on and potentially they won't get the answer they want. So that's my suspicion, but I don't know.
So, Mariam, Alvin's given you a hard act to follow here by saying do both. What are your thoughts on these two choices? 200 countries agreeing a diluted agreement, or a coalition to proceed faster and leave the other countries behind? What are your thoughts?
Well, initially, when I first heard that, I thought I was going to be selfish and say I want both. But apparently, Alvin also agrees. So I'm quite glad that there is this common way of thought. I think it is important to have a baseline that most people can get on. And then when you see that smaller group, if you will, actually do these policies, do these actions, I think you will start to see slight encouragement to actually meet from the baseline to actually meet that of the smaller group. I think that's where you'll start to see that the baseline will slowly move up. And I say slowly because it depends on each country. I think they'll slowly start moving up towards that smaller group. And I think that's what we need. We need a baseline, but a smaller group that these people want to be part of the smaller group because they are able to do our actions and policies that are beneficial for them. I think that's what I think.
Amazing. So you and Alvin agreeing again. The only thing I'd pick up on here is that certainly my hope is that the 1.5 coalition group or whatever is a big group. I mean, if you're a smaller country, there's 200 countries in the world. We've got 20 countries who are big players in fossil fuels. For me, I'd want to have a situation where all of the smaller countries who don't have a lot of political clout, they don't have the money and whatever, I would want them all to be joining the 1.5 or whatever group, because it's a no-brainer, really. They're going to get the support and interest of the others. They're going to get people like Denmark wanting to share technology and stuff with them, and the amazing discussions we've had earlier about what countries can really do. So let's move on then to look at, okay, so what next? What's the most important thing to do next? We've touched on a little bit of this already, which is this idea of the countries who want to do more coming together and starting to do more. But can we do a lot more here? What are your thoughts on what we really need to do up next? So, Alvin, back over to you, please.
It's such a really difficult question. I think when we talk about the countries, what can we do more? I think it's very, very simple things. And it's really along the lines of this is both a policy and economic and business. So all of those things have to come together. And I get very frustrated when people talk about, we won't do this policy because it damages our economy, when we have many, many examples of governments enacting policies and businesses immediately respond and find ways to continue to make money with those policy restrictions. Because even if we were to, we have policies on businesses all around the world to stop them from doing unbelievable pollution. They still pollute, but not nearly as much as if it was a free-for-all. And that's something that we do all the time. So for me, I think there are two things. One, we need to start getting serious about policy, incentives, and also the stick as well. That's the first part of it. I think the second part of it is that we actually need to see, this is me losing the plot, I just had it and then it's gone. So for me, I think it's, let's start with that policy level first.
Okay, we'll come back to you. Yeah, no sweat. We'll come back to you.
When my mind wakes up, it's late.
So Mariam, you're on quicker than you thought. Go for it.
I think what we need to see is the commitment to already foundational policies, and we need to see that carried on, but actually enacted, and actually that these things actually happen, and that we see it continue years on. But I also think that we need to start listening to people more. I think governments need to look at their population, look at the citizens, look at young people. They need to start listening to them as well. I think it's good to have a discussion with leaders around the world and say, well, we need to commit to this and this and this, but you also need to look at young people's wishes and views and also put that in your commitments as well, and carry these commitments on each year forward, I think. And hopefully within each year you see a commitment achieved and pushed further. I think that there's always room for pushing for more And I think that's what needs to happen. So you meet a target, well, I would like to see that you meet your target, you meet something that you want to do, and you push for more within that target, because you can't just stop at one place and say, that's it, we've achieved it. No, I think you need to push for more.
So the targets and monitoring is a really, really important point. But I've got on my list here, I think it's really important that the world has this 100 days plan. I've seen in the draft the idea that plans for COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, start immediately after this, which is a little bit of that idea. But I think for me, the idea of a 100 days plan, and to link that into what Mariam's just been talking about. Let's have some specific achievements that people commit to make a start on within those 100 days. And then the second thing really is, I go to the example of the Olympics. So we had the Olympics in the UK in 2012. And two or 3 years in advance of that, there was a sort of panic as to whether it would be ready. And because the thing is with global warming is that everything gets kicked down the road, the can gets kicked down the road to another year. There's always going to be another meeting. But with the Olympics, that's not possible because it has a fixed date, and you can have some events which may be a sort of in inferior facilities or whatever. But the bulk of the thing, you've got millions of people coming in, you've got TV cameras everywhere. The thing's got to be ready. And I think it's time for governments to be saying, look, this is what we want, and handing over to really professional, delivery-oriented people who are used to working to goals and targets to achieve something by a specific date. And I think we can't carry on with the thing run by diplomats and bureaucrats who are compromisers and ditherers by trade. It's got to be handed over to people who are more action oriented. And I think I was impressed by this point about countries working together. I think there's a lot more scope for that. But I wonder if yes, of course, there's going to be marches and action and people protesting in the West, in the UK and in the UK and Europe. But isn't it time to really try and get more action by people in the countries where there are the blockages, like in places like Brazil? You've mentioned some issues with Indonesia, India. Even Saudi Arabia. Is it possible to have more action from the citizens of these countries to make it happen? Because us here in the UK shouting, even us shouting in Australia, is not going to make a difference. What's really going to make a difference, as Alvin talked about earlier, is people at more grassroots in the country doing something. Is that possible with some of the countries who are putting in place these blockages? So Alvin, back over to you.
I think it is, to a degree. There's always going to be the questions of sovereignty around this, so it has to come from inside. So particularly somewhere like Brazil, I think the kind of changes that are going to happen there as a result of deforestation and around the Amazon, and then the consequences of that, the impacts on the country itself, it tends to be when the impacts land that people start to act. And I think why we're seeing the younger generation really engaging with this is because they can see the impacts that they're going to have to face on a much more regular basis. And I've said it last time I was here, and I still think it's very true. Once the young people get out in the streets, their grandmothers and grandfathers and their parents become engaged as well. Because if things have got bad enough for school children to march in the streets for change, and you have parents and grandparents who love them, you actually have a much larger block. Now, a really simple example is when, say, at the beginning of this decade, in Australia and I think around a lot of other Western countries, when an election turned up, climate change featured around number 9 or number 10 on the list of things that really mattered. Since the school strike for climate really kicked off, it's usually number 3. It's usually economy, jobs, and climate change in that order. It used to be economy, jobs, daylight, and then some other things. Climate change has popped in, and people are now starting to equate those two things, that, jobs and economy and climate change, these things are all coming together. So I think that action is going to come. it does have to happen internally. I would also love to see the UN enact an international law that if you have a country that suffers climate change impacts really badly and leads to an enormous number of refugees, then those countries that polluted the most must take the bulk of those refugees instantly. And that, I think, would suddenly make them go, okay, perhaps we better do something outside our borders before it becomes a problem inside our borders. Speculative, unlikely, but if they were to do it, it would be very, very interesting to see the response.
I think a simpler example of that, Alvin, is in the UK to make it an obligation on supermarkets that you take the packaging back to the supermarket, that if you bought it, then for me that would immediately, in a much lighter way, have an impact. So let's test your theory with the supermarket packaging first. But Mariam, pressure's on you now. You guys are all trying to study and learn and grow up and everything. And Alvin's now saying that you've got this big opportunity to do more and step up. What can you do?
I think when you look at young people, I think the best thing that we can do, as many have been doing, is making noise, writing to MPs, protesting, really showing your voice. But then I think we can look at aspects of further educating the people around us. I think that we have to carry on. I don't think that young people or people generally should ever stop doing what they're already doing in terms of pushing for climate change actions to actually happen. I think that this is where we should carry on, because when you make noise, governments need to start listening. And if you have a big enough voice and if you're making enough noise, I think then they'll realize that these noises that we're making need to be listened to. And I think that's what needs to really be pushed, and not just in the UK. I think that hopefully other countries, and not just the global north, I think hopefully other countries should also start to make noise from the roots. Making noises will always, I believe, will always do or make an impact.
Okay, but what about this question, Mariam, of the fact that maybe the more of the noise needs to be made not in countries like the UK, France, and whatever. Maybe more of the noise needs to be made in Brazil and India and places. How is that? How can that be achieved?
I think each country, first of all, is different. I think that's something that we all acknowledge. I think leadership is a big part of it. Are you able to make that noise and you are listened to? So are you listened to? Can you do it and you can safely do it? I think that's something that needs to be addressed, because you may have governments that might be slightly oppressive towards making noises. So that needs to be taken into account for. And I think to ensure that these noises and these protests and whatnot have the safety net, there needs maybe something like the UN needs to do, have one of their points on their charter or something. It should have a protection or a safety net for these people who are making the noises in these other countries like Brazil, because the government may not always necessarily agree with you making such noises.
Such a great idea. Now, Mariam, more pressure on you. You're a student in London, which is maybe the most international city in the world. You're doing a course at one of the most international schools in the world, SOAS, and you're studying international relations. Now, what about your chums? What about your classmates in your year, the years above you, the years below you? If we were to talk to them about this message we've just been talking about, would this resonate? Would they join in? Would they take action? Can we have the world being reinvented out of SOAS?
I would like to say yes. I think the world can do that. But if you look at my peers in SOAS, I think that we do have a strong view towards this, and it is something that we generally do hold the same consensus about. I think when you look at my peers, it's really looking about ensuring that the global north and the global south are as one, and ensuring that we are all at the same level. I think that's where we need to begin. So ensuring that there is a variety of voices heard from across the world. I think that's something that they would see that is something important. I think that ensuring that in our education and in our systems that there is education about the environment. I think that's something that they would push for as well. I think that we could it could be echoed around everywhere, but it's these sort of baseline. I say the word baseline again. It's this sort of idea that that education is important and that understanding collaboration is important. I think these are the really two big things.
Okay, Mariam, well, look, if you want to pick this one up, we've had 100 speakers this year, and I'm sure that most of those speakers would want to help you with this. I certainly would. I think Alvin would as well. And another wonderful institution who's been amazing with us this year is Columbia University, New York, and their course on climate change. So we've had 5 speakers from Columbia University, New York, including two from India and 2 from the UK. So if you want to give them a call and get some friends to help you with this campaign, definitely Columbia University is it's the master's course there. It's a fabulous starting point. They were so good. Okay, so Gary, you've been with us on all of these things. We've just had an amazing discussion as ever with our 2 fantastic speakers.
Yeah.
Gary, do you want to give your thoughts on where we are?
I will. I agree that subcommittees are so important, but getting the media attention, when I first started with Charles, it would take, the climate was a tiny part of the newspaper and on the news, and we really dominated that. So taking the very best of what COP's created, so we can understand that the average person on the street makes a choice. Now, has anyone ever heard of a gentleman called Brian May? Now, he's not the lead guitarist in Queen. He's actually a goal mapping expert. So I'd like to just, as we finish this, put some goal mapping together. Now, Charles doesn't quite know what this is about, but I'm going to spring it on him. So a question for all 3 of you. You're allowed 1 answer each. So why, I know it sounds really obvious, but why would we care about climate change? Within a minute, if that's okay. Charles, why do we care about global climate change?
For me, Gary, it's back to what we've been saying all the while. It's unthinkable that we, the most intelligent people ever on this planet, could possibly allow the future of our children and grandchildren to be wrecked by something which not only have we caused, we have the ability to stop. We've got someone we've had people on the moon. We've got enough weapons to destroy the rest of the world, and yet we seem unable to fix this. We have to fix it. It's absolutely critical. We fix it. Next
we
speaker.
Start with the why. Alvin, why is global warming so important? Why is climate change? Within a minute.
Simple. In a minute, easy. It's not a problem for the planet. Planet will survive it, and it will come back in however many million years. It's used to doing things nice and slowly. For us, however, it's going to start off by making our lives harder. And we're going to start feeling that in this generation and then the next generation. And then it's going to start knocking away the supports of civilization. And then it is going to start not just undermining our civilization, but our ability to live on this planet. This is very, very simply a life choice for us as a species. When I said before at the beginning of this, COP26 right now, we are making the choice as to whether or not we want to be part of the Earth's recovery. If we don't act, we won't be here. Simple as that.
Mariam, very powerful. Wow, Mariam.
We're seeing devastation today, and we're going to see greater devastation in the future. I think that this is something that we really need to see, that there are going to be huge consequences in the future and this will heavily impact our lives. And so if we want to carry on living a better life, a better quality of life for everyone, we need to make that change now so we don't have huge problems and devastation in the future.
So Mr. May says that it's not just about the why. The next step to make change is a goal. Is our goal just the 1.5? Charles, we'll start with you. What are the goals for COP, but not only to create a sustainable Earth for us all?
Gary, for me, climate change is incredibly complicated. And for anybody coming new to this, it can be very confusing. There are literally millions of pages of documents. And this is why I like 1.5 max. okay, Alvin's maybe going to persuade me that it needs to be a different figure, but there's a huge simplicity about 1.5 max. You've heard it here. No one else is talking about it. We've gone from 1.5 to keeping 1.5 alive. For me, the answer is the simple number is 1.5 max. Combine that with everything else that people have said, and this is the one simple target that people can focus on.
Brilliant. Alvin.
I am so going to disagree with that.
I
actually think that I think temperatures are an appalling measure, because we're at 1.1 now, right? If we were to stop putting CO2 into the air today, we'd still drift up above 1.5, almost certainly. So as a measure, it's pointless because it's delayed. But there's one measure that works every single time, and that is how many carbon emissions are we putting into the atmosphere? We just need to flatten that curve like we did with COVID. So you have a look at the Keeling curve. When that starts to flatten, and you can measure that by country, by industry, and globally, and you can see a change within 2 months. So it doesn't happen. You can see straight away. You can see if something works or if it doesn't work. You can see if someone's cheating or they're not cheating. So for me, that is it. I don't want temperature targets. They tell me how bad things will be when we get there. I want carbon emissions being flattened, because that I see now, and that makes a real difference. And that is the only thing that matters through this whole discussion that we've had tonight. If we don't flatten those emissions, we failed. It's that simple.
Brilliant. Arian, no pressure here, right? You've got quite a distinguished panel here, but look, what would be your goal?
I think my goal for me, first and foremost, is that young people have their policies in place. I think that's something that for me is of utmost importance. But then it's also looking at how much emissions are out there and what temperatures are we reaching. I'll actually combine the two of them. And I think that because they both have very valid points, I think that it's important to look at these two aspects and really see what is going on and ensure that we are able, as Alvin said, to straighten this curve, but also ensure that we are only reaching max 1.5. I think they both have very valid arguments, but yeah, those are
there's only 3 more steps to the Brian May setting a goal cap. Who is responsible for shaping this? So Charles, who is responsible for shaping this within 30 seconds, if that's okay?
I think, Gary, it's easy to think that the world leaders, it's their responsibility and the people, but I think this is one where really it's responsibility of everybody, the world leaders, with the governments, the local authority leaders, the communities, big business, small business, and individuals. It's everyone's responsibility to play their part in this. And unless everyone does, then we are going to fail. Everyone has to be heading the same way, and everyone has to be positive about this. There's so much negative news. All the time people are saying, oh, planting trees isn't a great idea. It doesn't work too well. Planting the wrong trees in the wrong place. As long as the world's full of all this negative energy, we're not going to get there. There has to be a lot of positive energy, and everyone has to be on board.
Alvin, who makes the change? Who should be in there for our why and our goal?
So you're looking for the leverage point, and I agree with Charles. I think this is multiple leverage points. It has to be changes in policy at all levels of government. It has to be changes in behaviour, because if you change in behaviour and people see it and they start to follow that same behaviour, then you start to see change at a grassroots level. So this is really tough. And one of the things is there's no single silver bullet. So everybody has to do something. And we probably have to start looking at the whole of life of all those products and things that we use as well, and actually pay back the environment for the services that it gives us. Because at the moment we're getting them all for free. Well, not really, because the cost is coming. So yeah.
Mariam?
I think that it's everyone, and I think governments need to put this as one of the, if not the top of their manifestos. I think that's where we'll see that it's at the forefront. When it's at the forefront, you'll see people start to take huge interest in it, and you'll start to see that there is a dedication that they have to commit to. And I think that's where we will start to see some sort of change.
So the final step in Brian May's change goal mapping, the last 2 steps are hand in hand. How are we going to do it, and by when? So let's keep this sharp and concise. We'll start with Marion this time and end with Charles. So Marion, how do we do this within 30 seconds and by when?
Well, how do we do this? There needs to be dedication, policy needs to change, and it needs to be at the forefront of every conversation. When, that I feel is a difficult answer. There is no definite answer, but it should happen as soon as possible. When everyone wants to start talking, when people want to start making change and collaborating with other countries, then we will see that.
You can
that
cheat and say yesterday if you like. Alvin, how are we going to do this, and when is our deadline?
Well, we've passed the deadline, so now. And really simply, with our vote, we simply care and we vote. As soon as we do that, governments and businesses will respond. Governments do it to stay in power. Businesses do it because they have a social license that if they lose that social license, they collapse as a business. So we start with the vote, and we start with how we shop and buy and behave. It's really that simple.
Brilliant. Charles,
Gary,
how and when?
Gary, we have the next meeting scheduled. It's COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh. The meeting's already scheduled, so that's great. What we don't have as yet the 100 days. So we add the 100 days to that, and we add Mariam's wonderful insight about the need for targets. So we set the target of having some stuff agreed within the 100 days. And as I said before, we look to change the team. We want a proper football manager in here. We're going to change the team to action-oriented goal scorers who are going to make a huge difference to this whole thing. So apologies to people in the who've put wonderful questions in the chat. Bob Warnan, your question about the US not accepting border issues. Rob, thank you so much for your support. I think the flow of the discussion has been that we are at the end of the discussion now, Gary, unless your friend Brian May has any more points.
No, that was it. Why, goals, the main goal,
great.
Who, how, and then the day.
Gary, we've blown away, unless you want to have a go at answering them as well.
Why for my children. The goal is a mix. I love what you said, Marion. It's a mixture of what Charles and Alvin said, looking at a holistic approach to this. Who, when you say in marketing, when you say anybody, it means nobody. If like every human being on this planet, indigenous, a city dweller, a farmer, one by one, we all have our role to play. How yesterday I was telling Charles that I wanted the stir fry. I fancied the stir fry, so I went into a supermarket and I pulled down 2 runner beans, and they both were around the same price. One was produced in France, the other one in South America. My choice was very simple. The carbon emissions to get this runner bean all the way from I made my choice there. The choices are very simple sometimes and quite complex. You're going to go carless, electric, or a diesel. It's up to you. And then by when? Yesterday.
Okay, so we're going to come now. Thank you so much, Gary. We're going to come to final comments in a minute. But Alvin, let's let you and I talk more about the goal, because I'm happy to negotiate with you on changing my goal of 1.5 max to a goal that you have here. So let's talk more about changing that goal, and so that what we agree will be live on screen as soon as possible, won't it, Gary? So in terms of final words, Mariam, over to you.
Change should have happened ages ago, but it didn't. And I think this change is going to happen, but when are leaders going to be dedicated to listening to young people, to listening to people as a whole? That's a question that we need to find out, really. And I hope that there will be policy dedication. I hope that these leaders will start to listen and collaborate with each other, not just think about selfish individual needs. I think that's what I'm hoping from the outcome.
Alvin.
God, I hate being depressing, but I think I'm going to be. I feel like that this all revolves around pain, and that we're not going to see any action until everyone starts to feel the pain of climate change. And one of the things that we're all from democracies in one form or another. So it's quite easy for us and for me to talk about a vote, but that's not true of a lot of other countries around the world. And as Mariam was saying before, in some places, it's just not safe to raise your voice. So I think at the end of the day, when the people in power and the people with money start to feel the pain, that is when we'll suddenly see a whole lot of action. But in the meantime, public pressure, social license, the things that we can do can actually start making them feel that pain a little bit earlier. And that's our job.
Okay, thank you so much to our speaker team here today. Thank you to the other 15 or 20 speakers who've spoken on these events, COP26 live events in these webinars. And thank you to the 100 people who've spoken on our 1.5 Max webinars all this year. In terms of action going forward, I wasn't expecting to get to this point, but I'm going to talk to Alvin about changing my goals. I'm really hoping that Mariam and SOAS can get together with Columbia University, New York, and some other places, and can make a real difference over the next, well, set yourself the 100 days goal. And Mariam, I'm sure we're going to be seeing you in the House of Commons with a lead role. And let's get you there as soon as possible, because you're a so much better speaker than a lot of the people there. So everybody, Gary, a huge thank you to you, a huge thank you to our audience. Do share this, because this has definitely been the best discussion we've had here, Gary. And thanks for the Brian May impersonator. Please share this with everybody, and that way we can make a difference and we can achieve something special in the next 100 days. Thank you so much.
Let's not forget that this broadcast has been sponsored by No CO2. It's never been easier to plant trees that are effective very quickly, effective in changing the carbon to oxygen. So what you do, you go onto the noco2.org website, donate as little as £7 a month, and you plant trees. This is one solution, a very quick solution. And not only that, it's actually helping the ecosystem over there in Madagascar by paying for a family to plant those trees. So Charles, you have been inspirational, and your energy and putting all these speakers together. Big thank you to you. And I'm sure on everyone that's watched most of these and has been tuning in have been inspired. There's so much work that goes on in the background. Thank you to all the speakers that have been there. And let's see what change we see in the next 100 days. I think it's only appropriate for Charles to wrap this broadcast up.
Huge thank you to everybody. The hard work starts now. The COP26 campaign is over. The COP27 campaign starts now. I really hope you're in. If you're all in, then connect with me on LinkedIn, connect with me by email, devices or whatever. We all need to be playing our part, as we've heard today. Now, Gary's going to open up the lines to everyone we're going to stop the recording and open up the lines to everybody to have their say. So this is your first opportunity to join in the new plan for COP27. A huge thanks to everybody.